The steward arrived before the smell had cleared. That is the detail the manorial records do not state directly, but the dates make it plain. In village after village across Essex and the English Midlands in the autumn and winter of 1348, the Lord's estate officer, the man responsible for recording tenancies, collecting dues, and maintaining the rent roll, appears in the surviving court documents within days, sometimes within a week, of death tallies that had emptied households entire. He was not there to grieve. He was there because the law required his presence, and because the law had specific instructions for exactly this situation. The harvest in many of these villages was still standing in the fields. Step back for a moment, because that unharvested grain is not a symbol of ruin. It is the first clue that something other than simple catastrophe was operating here. To understand what the steward was doing, you have to understand the world he moved through, a world whose legal architecture had been built, stone by careful stone, across 2.5 centuries of English feudal administration. By the middle of the 14th century, the English manor was not merely a piece of land, it was a legal instrument. Every tenant who worked that land held their holding not as owners, but as occupants, bound to the Lord by a web of obligations recorded in ink on parchment rolls that were copied, stored, and referenced with a precision that would have impressed a modern property registry. When a tenant died, the law did not pause. The most immediate mechanism was called Herlihy. It was ancient, it was routine, and it was, under normal circumstances, a modest irritation. When a villain, a bound tenant, died, the Lord was entitled to seize the tenant's best animal, a horse, an ox, sometimes a cow. It was the feudal equivalent of a death tax, paid not in coin but in livestock, and it had been collected so consistently for so long that most tenants factored it into the grim mathematics of what they would leave behind. In a normal year, Herlihy was marginal. A lord with 200 tenants might collect it a dozen times, the steady, unremarkable arithmetic of ordinary death. But in the autumn of 1348, in the villages that the plague reached first, it did not fire a dozen times. It fired across entire households simultaneously. The steward's ledger, in some manners, began to look less like an estate record and more like an inventory of a sudden, enormous transfer. And Herlihy was only the beginning. When a tenant died without an adult male heir, which, in a catastrophe that struck without warning and moved faster than any messenger, happened with a frequency that the legal system had never been designed to process at scale, the tenancy itself did not simply sit empty. It eschated. It returned to the Lord. The land reverted. The obligation dissolved upward. The Hilton Manor records in the English Midlands, studied in detail by the historians V. Razi, offer one of the closest documented views of this process across the decades following the plague. What those records show, carefully and across a long arc of evidence, is a pattern of holding consolidation, surviving family members absorbing neighboring tenancies, and lords gaining control of plots where no viable heir could be produced. It was not universal, it was not instantaneous, but it was consistent, and it was legal, and it required no special cruelty from any individual lord to operate exactly as designed. The steward riding into a half-empty village in Essex in November of 1348 was not improvising. He was following a document, executing a procedure. The procedure had existed before the plague, had been designed for the ordinary rhythm of death and succession, and was now running, for the first time in its history, at a volume and speed that no one had anticipated, and no one had prepared to resist. The fields were full. The question was never whether the grain would be harvested. The question was who would own the land it grew from, and whose name would appear on the roll when the spring planting came. 3 machines were running simultaneously in the autumn of 1348. They did not coordinate. They did not need to. They had been built independently over generations, and each one was designed to ensure that property, land, money, obligation moved in a specific direction when a human life ended. The plague did not create these machines. It stress-tested them at a scale no designer had envisioned, and they held. The first was feudal tenure. You already know the shape of it, but the details matter more than the outline. The English manorial system, by the mid-14th century, was a bureaucratic apparatus of considerable sophistication. Lords maintained estate offices. Clerks kept duplicate records. Rent rolls were updated seasonally. When a holding eschated, when a tenant died without a qualifying heir, the process that followed was not arbitrary seizure. It was a court proceeding. The manor court sat. Surviving neighbors were called to testify about the dead tenant's family situation. The steward consulted the roll. A judgment was recorded. The land was reassigned, or held in the lord's hand, or offered to a new tenant at terms the lord now had considerably more power to set. In the years immediately following the first plague wave, lords across England found themselves holding more land in their direct control than they had managed in decades. In some documented cases, particularly in the heavily affected counties of the East and Southeast, entire tenancies sat temporarily vacant. Not because the legal claim had lapsed, but because there were not yet enough surviving laborers willing to accept the traditional terms. The land waited, the roll waited, the obligation waited. The second machine was ecclesiastical, and it operated through a mechanism that was, in its own way, even more durable than feudal tenure. The church's landholding in 14th century England rested on a foundation of endowments, gifts made by wealthy families, by dying lords, by merchants seeking spiritual intercession, by widows negotiating for masses to be said for their husband's soul. These were not loans, they were not conditional transfers, they were permanent alienations of property to institutions that, by legal definition, could not die. A monastery did not age, it did not produce heirs, it did not fail to leave a will, it simply continued, and the land it held continued with it. The plague produced a documented surge in deathbed donations. This is not a surprising observation. When people believed they were dying from a divine catastrophe, the impulse to convert material wealth into spiritual intercession was rational within the logic of the period. Surviving probate records and monastic cartularies from English houses, including those studied in the context of the Winchester and Canterbury estates, show an increase in land and goods transferred to ecclesiastical institutions in the plague, years and immediately afterward. The precise scale varied significantly by house and region, and historians differ on the long-term aggregate effect. But the direction was consistent. The dying gave, and the institutions received, and the institutions could not give it back because they had no mechanism for death. This created a quiet, compounding accumulation. Each endowment wave, and there had been several before the plague, tied to earlier crises and earlier fears, added to a portfolio that was managed by administrators who answered to no heir, faced no escheat, and whose institutional memory extended across generations in a way that no individual noble family could match. The third machine was debt, and it was concentrated most visibly in the commercial cities, in the wool trade networks of England, in the credit instruments circulating between London merchants and Flemish buyers, in the bonds and obligations that littered the records of every significant commercial transaction of the period. Debt, in the 14th century, was a legal claim on assets. It did not dissolve when the debtor died. It transferred to the estate, and the estate's administrators, whether family members, royal officials, or ecclesiastical executors, were legally obligated to satisfy it before distributing anything else. A creditor presenting a properly documented obligation before an ecclesiastical probate court or a royal court of common pleas held a senior claim. The dead's property moved first toward those who held paper. The great Florentine banking houses, the Bardi and the Peruzzi, had already collapsed by 1345, their extended credit to the English crown having proved catastrophically uncollectible. But the instruments they had pioneered did not collapse with them. Letters of obligation, deposit agreements, exchange contracts. These were tools now in wide use among English wool merchants, Flemish traders, and Italian agents operating through the London Steel Yard and the port of Southampton. When plague moved through a merchant's household in Bristol or Lynn in 1348, his creditors did not wait for the grief to clear. They appeared before the appropriate court with their documents, and the documents spoke with an authority the dead could no longer contest. The lawyers, stewards, abbots, and creditors were not predators circling a wounded body. They were clerks doing their jobs, and their jobs had never been busier. The machine ran, but it did not run evenly, and it did not run without resistance, and in the gap between what the system was designed to do and what the survivors were now willing to accept, a pressure began to build that the architects of the old order had not anticipated and would spend the next 3 decades trying to contain. The survivors were not a random sample of the population that had existed before 1348. Death at this scale and speed selected its victims without reference to legal status, but the legal consequences of death were distributed with extraordinary specificity. A villain with an adult male heir lost his best animal and kept his holding. A villain whose entire household was taken, whose wife, sons, and brothers died within the same fortnight, left behind a tenancy with no one to claim it, no one to appear before the manor court, no one whose name the steward could write into the surviving column of the roll. The holding escheated. The land moved. Women in this period occupied a particularly exposed position in the inheritance architecture. A widow whose husband had held a villain tenancy was entitled, in many manners, to a portion of the holding for her lifetime, a right called free bench, which varied in its terms from manor to manor and was recorded, if at all, in the same rolls that the steward carried. If she could produce a son who would take on the obligations, the tenancy might survive intact. If she could not, the negotiation with the Lord was conducted from a position of considerable weakness. She needed the land. The Lord had the document. The document said what the land was worth, and who had the right to set the terms of its continued occupation. This asymmetry of documentation is one of the clearest patterns in the surviving manor court records from the post-plague decades. Those who could produce evidence of their claims, written records, witnesses, seals, named obligations, survived the legal processing of the catastrophe with something in hand. Those who could not produce evidence, whose claims rested on memory and custom and the testimony of neighbors who were themselves dead, found the machinery running against them with a quiet, procedural efficiency that required no individual malice to operate. But here is where the story turns in a direction the lords had not calculated. Labor was scarce, not everywhere, not uniformly, not in every county or every season, but in the villages that had lost a third or more of their working population, and in some heavily affected areas of East Anglia and the southeast, the losses documented in surviving poll tax and manorial records suggest figures at or above that range, though historians note significant variation. The arithmetic of agricultural production had shifted in a way that no legal document could immediately correct. The fields still needed plowing, the sheep still needed shearing, the grain still needed carrying to the mill. And the men and women who remained alive to do those things were suddenly aware, with a clarity that must have felt almost dangerous, that their labor was worth more than the Statute of Laborers said it was. The Statute of Laborers was passed by the English Parliament in 1351. Its intent was precise, and its language was unambiguous. Wages were to be fixed at the levels that had prevailed before the plague. Laborers who demanded more were subject to imprisonment. Employers who paid more were subject to fines. The statute applied to agricultural workers, craftsmen, and servants alike. It was, in the most direct sense possible, a legal attempt to cancel the one economic advantage that mass death had accidentally produced for those at the bottom of the hierarchy, and to cancel it, not through negotiation or market adjustment, but through compulsion. The statute was evaded constantly. Surviving court records from the 1350s and 1360s show prosecutions, fines, and evasions in roughly equal measure. Lords who needed their harvests brought in, paid the market rate quietly, and reported compliance publicly. Laborers who could walk to the next manor and find a lord desperate enough to pay above the legal ceiling did exactly that. The mobility of labor, which the old villain system had been designed to prevent, became in the post-plague years a practical reality that the statute could slow but not stop. In France, the fiscal pressure took a different form. The taille, a direct tax levied primarily on commoners, administered through royal and seigneurial channels, continued to be collected through and after the plague years, in many regions assessed against households rather than individuals. When households shrank or disappeared, the burden did not always shrink proportionally. Surviving taxpayers in some documented communities found themselves carrying obligations that reflected the pre-plague population of their village more than its devastated present. The French crown's fiscal needs did not contract with its taxpayers. The tax rolls, like the English manorial rolls, had a life independent of the living people they described. The Church, meanwhile, was managing its own internal contradiction with rather less grace than its property records might suggest. The clergy had died in enormous numbers. Parish priests, who by the nature of their role had remained in contact with the sick and the dying, were among the most exposed individuals in any community. In some English dioceses, surviving institution records, the documents by which bishops formally installed replacement clergy, show vacancy rates that historians have estimated at over 40% across the plague years, with some parishes turning over multiple times in a single 12-month period. The institutional response was pragmatic and, to many observers of the time, deeply alarming. Ordination standards were lowered, the minimum age for taking orders was reduced, and men entered the priesthood with training that, by the standards of a decade earlier, would have been considered incomplete. The spiritual authority of the Church, its claim to explain suffering, to mediate between the living and God, to make sense of a catastrophe that had killed the righteous alongside the wicked without apparent discrimination, had taken a wound that its land records could not heal. The endowments were intact. The tithes were collectible. The institutional structure of diocese, chapter, and monastery continued to function. But the explanatory framework that had given that structure its legitimacy was visibly strained, and the men now standing at the altars of half the parishes in England were not always equipped to repair it. The Statute of Laborers was, in a sense, the Crown's acknowledgement that the dead had accomplished something the living had never managed. They had temporarily broken the price of labor. And the Crown was not willing to let that stand. The bill arrived in the summer of 1381. 33 years after the first plague ships reached the English south coast, the accumulated pressure of post-plague fiscal extraction, legally enforced wage suppression, and frustrated inheritance produced something the manorial rolls had no column for. A rebellion that moved faster than the royal administration could contain it, and that, for a matter of days in June of that year, placed rebel forces inside the city of London, opened the Tower, executed the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Lord Treasurer on Tower Hill, and brought a 14-year-old king, Richard II, out onto the open ground at Mile End to face a crowd whose demands were, above everything else, legally specific. They wanted the abolition of villanage. They wanted a fixed land rent of 4p per acre. They wanted the freedom to buy, sell, and move without the Lord's permission. These were not the demands of people who had failed to understand the system. These were the demands of people who understood it precisely, who had lived inside its mechanisms for 30 years and could name, with the clarity of personal experience, the exact points where it extracted from them most efficiently. The rebels burned records. This detail appears across multiple surviving accounts of the Rising, in the Chronicles of Thomas Walsingham, in the Anonimalle Chronicle, in Royal Commission records compiled afterward. At manor houses, at legal inns, at ecclesiastical offices, the rebels targeted the documents: rent rolls, obligation bonds, villain registers, the records that established who owed what to whom, that encoded 3 generations of tenure and debt and legal status in ink that had survived the plague untouched. The rebels understood that the document was not a description of their condition. It was the instrument of it. Burning the roll did not change the land, but it destroyed the evidence of who was legally bound to whom, and in a system that ran on documentation, the absence of documentation was a form of freedom, however temporary. The Lord Steward could not collect a heriot he could not prove. The manor court could not enforce a villain's obligation it could not demonstrate. The creditor could not claim an estate without his bond. The rebels were right about the paper. They were not wrong about what it meant. But the machine had learned, across 2.5 centuries of feudal administration, to distribute itself. The exchequer held records. Ecclesiastical courts held probate documents. Chancery held enrolled copies of major grants and obligations. Estate offices in undisturbed manors held cartularies that referenced the holdings of neighboring manors destroyed in the Rising. The attempt to erase the legal architecture by burning its local instances failed not because the rebels lacked determination, but because the architecture had never existed only in one place. The confrontation at Smithfield, where the rebel leader Wat Tyler met with the King's Party on the 15th of June, ended in Tyler's death. The precise sequence remains contested across the surviving accounts, but the outcome was not. The young king's promises, made at Mile End and confirmed in the immediate aftermath of Tyler's killing, were withdrawn before most of the rebel contingents had reached home. A royal proclamation issued in the weeks that followed declared that all grants of freedom made under duress were legally void. The villains remained villains. The rolls, or their copies, reasserted their authority. The suppression was not savage in its immediate legal aftermath. There were executions, several hundred by most historical estimates, with the rebel leaders and some local organizers receiving summary justice. But the Crown did not attempt to punish entire communities. It did not need to. The withdrawal of the promises was punishment enough, because it demonstrated the thing that mattered most. The legal order had been tested under direct confrontation, and it had held. In France, a generation earlier, the same logic had played out with greater immediate violence. The Jacquerie of 1358, a rural uprising in the Ile-de-France, connected to the political and fiscal chaos following the English capture of the French king at Poitiers, was suppressed within weeks by noble forces who understood, with the instinct of a class that had recently been made to feel economically vulnerable, that the moment required demonstration rather than negotiation. The noble response was coordinated and swift. The uprising's leaders were killed. The villages that had participated were made to understand the cost of participation. The targets of the Jacquerie, like those of the English Rising, had included manorial records, noble houses, and the physical apparatus of seigneurial administration. The pattern was the same across the Channel, separated by 2 decades. People who had understood the machine clearly enough to attack its documentation, met by a class that had understood the machine clearly enough to defend it with organized force. By the 1380s, the short window of post-plague labor leverage in England was narrowing. Not closing entirely, the legal abolition of villanage would come gradually across the following century as the practical difficulties of enforcement accumulated. But the window that mass death had briefly opened, in which the price of surviving labor had threatened to permanently redistribute the surplus of English agriculture, had been contained. Through statute, through withdrawal of promises, through the destruction of rebel leadership, through the recopying of burned rolls from duplicate sources held in offices the rebels had not reached. The machine had been tested. It held. And the rent roll that replaced the one burned at the manor house outside London in June of 1381 was indistinguishable from the original. Somewhere in Burgundy, in the 1380s, a young monk is copying a cartulary. He was not born when the plague arrived. He has no memory of the autumn of 1348, no memory of the stewards riding into half-empty villages, no memory of the manor courts processing the dead with the patience of a well-maintained instrument. He knows the plague the way a man knows a war that ended before his birth, as a fact of the world he inherited, not as an experience that shaped his body and his fear. He is working from fragments. The original cartulary was damaged in the disorder of the plague years. Water, neglect, the simple entropy of an institution that had lost many of the men responsible for maintaining its records. He has duplicate seals, partial copies, the memory of older monks who remember what the damaged pages said. He copies carefully, in the practiced hand of a man who understands that what he is transcribing is not history. It is property. The cartulary records the monastery's land rights, fields, vineyards, mills, fishing rights on a stretch of river whose name appears in grants dating back to the 11th century. It records the obligations of the families who farm those lands, the dues, the tithes, the feast day payments, the customary services owed at harvest. Some of the family names in the older sections of the cartulary no longer correspond to living people. They were replaced, in the plague decades, with new names, new tenants, new families, sometimes the same surnames attached to distant cousins who had survived where the direct line had not. The monk does not flag these replacements as remarkable. They are simply the current state of the record. He copies them as he finds them. Outside the scriptorium window, a field is being plowed by men whose grandfathers died without wills. This is the ending that the Black Death's economic history arrives at, if you follow it past the dramatic years of the first plague wave, and past the fires of 1381, and into the quieter, more administrative reality of a continent that had processed its catastrophe and arrived at a recognizable version of its former self. The population of Europe in the 1380s was still dramatically reduced from its pre-plague level. Historians studying the evidence from English poll tax records, French hearth taxes, and Italianestimi, the property assessments used by city governments, suggest that in many regions, the population would not recover to 1347 figures until the late 15th century at the earliest, and in some areas not until well into the 16th. The human cost was not temporary. It was a generational wound that took a century and a half to close. But the institutional cost was a different kind of arithmetic entirely. The monasteries held their land, the endowments made in terror during the plague years, the fields and vineyards and urban properties transferred to ecclesiastical houses by men and women who believed they were buying spiritual protection against a catastrophe that was already inside their walls, remained with the institutions that had received them. The donors were dead. The gifts were permanent. The church had absorbed the fear of an entire generation and converted it, through the ordinary machinery of property law, into an expansion of its material portfolio at the precise moment when its spiritual credibility was most severely strained. The explanatory framework had cracked. The cartulary had not. The noble estates of England, in the decades following the revolt of 1381, consolidated around the families that had managed the post-plague transition most effectively. Those who had maintained their documentation, replaced their labor supply through a combination of legal pressure and market concession, and survived the financial strain of managing holdings whose income had contracted while their administrative costs had not. The great lords had, in some cases, weathered the plague years with their domain lands enlarged by escheat, and their rental income temporarily disrupted by labor scarcity. The smaller lords, the minor gentry, the single manor families, had often found the post-plague decades more genuinely difficult, caught between the same labor market pressures as the great estates and without the administrative depth to manage them. The catastrophe had not uniformly benefited the powerful. It had benefited the organized. In the Italian city-states, the commercial families that survived the mid-century chaos, the collapse of the Bardi and Peruzzi, the disruption of the wool and spice trades, the contraction of papal banking, inherited a financial landscape that the plague had partially reorganized. The instruments survived their operators. Letters of credit, deposit accounts, exchange contracts. The tools that 14th-century Italian merchants had refined into the most sophisticated financial technology in the Western world continued to circulate, continued to create claims, continued to move property through the hands of whoever held the relevant paper. New families entered the space that old ones had vacated. The Medici, who would become the dominant financial force in Florence across the following century, did not cause this reorganization. They arrived after it, equipped with the same instruments, operating in a landscape that the plague and its aftermath had, in ways both brutal and procedural, made available. The spiritual damage was real, and it was lasting. The church that emerged from the second half of the 14th century was an institution whose material power remained largely intact and whose moral authority had taken a wound from which it would not fully recover. The men who had lowered ordination standards in the plague years, who had accepted the dying's property with one hand while failing to explain God's silence with the other, had created a credibility gap that would remain open, widening slowly, filled with growing resentment and competing interpretations across the following century and a half. The endowments did not cause the Reformation, but they were part of what made the Reformation's critique of ecclesiastical wealth so immediately legible to so many people when it finally arrived. A church that held the dead's land while failing the living's faith was a church that had made itself a target. It simply took 150 years for the target to become impossible to ignore. The villains of England were not freed by the revolt of 1381. They were freed, gradually and incompletely, across the following century, as the practical difficulties of enforcing villain status against a mobile, legally aware, and increasingly literate rural population accumulated beyond the point where enforcement was worth its cost. It was not compassion that ended villainage. It was administration. The machine, in the end, abandoned the mechanism, not because it had been persuaded that the mechanism was unjust, but because the mechanism had become more expensive to operate than the income it protected. Which is, perhaps, the coldest thing the story has to offer. The Black Death did not break the economic order that governed 14th century Europe. It accelerated it, stressed it, exposed its mechanisms with an unwanted clarity, and produced, in the gap between the dead's obligations and the living's willingness to honor them, 30 years of contested, legally managed, occasionally violent negotiation over who would bear the cost of a catastrophe that no one had caused and no one could explain. The powerful used the tools they had: the rent roll, the probate court, the statute, the royal proclamation, the organized suppression of revolt, with the efficiency of people who had built those tools over generations and understood, at some level beneath conscious strategy, that their continued relevance depended on those tools remaining functional. The monk in the Burgundian scriptorium sets down his quill. The cartulary is complete. The obligations are recorded. The fields outside the window are the same fields that appear in grants dated 200 years before the plague, held now by families whose connection to the original grantees is, in some cases, a matter of legal fiction rather than blood. But the connection is documented, and documentation in this world is the thing that makes a claim real. The dead have been processed. The living have been reorganized. The record is clean. And somewhere in the margin of the final page, in the careful hand of a man who was never asked to question what he was copying, the monastery's land rights extend forward into a future that looks, from the outside, remarkably like the past. Because the instrument that shapes it is the same instrument that shaped everything before. The obligation that survives the person, the document that outlasts the hand that signed it, the claim that waits, patient and perfectly legible for whoever arrives next to read it.